Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sound Mind podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of music psychology. I'm your host, Sophia, and as a music psychologist, I'll be guiding you through everything you've ever wondered about music. So, whether you're a music lover or just interested in the science of sound, you're in the right place, so stick with us. So, today we're exploring a so-called musical superpower known as perfect pitch, and its neurological opposite, amusia, which is sometimes referred to as tone deafness. So, okay, picture this. Someone hears a single note, just one, and immediately goes, that's an F sharp. There's no instrument nearby, no other notes for comparison, just instant, effortless recognition. And that right there is perfect pitch. But here's the thing. For every person with this rare ability, there's many others who experience music in a completely different way. People who love music but struggle to recognize melodies, follow rhythm, or even enjoy it in the way that most of us do. This is called amusia, and it's equally as fascinating because it challenges our assumptions about music being a universal language. So today's episode is about the full spectrum of pitch perception, from those who can identify a note out of nowhere to those whose brains quite literally can't process musical pitch. So what exactly is perfect pitch? Who has it and how do they use it? Is it something you're born with or can you learn it? And how does it compare to a condition like amusia, where music seems to lose all its structure and meaning? So let's get into it. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is perfect pitch? Well, perfect pitch, more formally called absolute pitch, is the rare ability to identify or produce a musical note without needing any external reference. With no lead up, no chords, no do, re, mi to anchor them. They just know. It's like having a built-in musical compass. Now, there's a similar sounding term, which is relative pitch, which is actually what most musicians rely on. And this is when you can tell the difference between two notes, like hearing a note and then another and knowing, okay, that's a perfect fifth apart, or this is the same melody but in a different key. See, relative pitch is a skill that you can typically build with practice, but perfect pitch, that's something a little bit different. Statistically, perfect pitch is extremely rare. It's estimated that fewer than 1 in 10,000 people have it. So, for most of us, even trained musicians, this ability is more like a unicorn than a norm. But for those who do have it, it can feel like a kind of musical superpower. You hear a note and instantly know it by name, like how we see the color red and just know that it's red. There's no need to compare it to blue, it's just instant recognition. There's actually a lot of celebrities with perfect pitch, and it's pretty impressive. Wolfgang Mozart is probably the most iconic. Stories suggest that as a toddler, he could name notes that were played on various instruments and even be correct when others were off key. Then there's Mariah Carey, who's not just known for her insane vocal range, but also for being able to name notes on the fly. Charlie Puth has also talked a lot about his perfect pitch on social media. He's even done some viral TikToks where he guesses notes from household sounds, which is pretty cool. Might be bragging about it, but pretty cool nonetheless. And more include Beethoven, Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, Ella Fitzgerald, Celine Dion. I could go on. Oh, that's kind of a pun. Unintentional, I promise. But perfect pitch isn't just a party trick for Western pop stars or classical prodigies. There's also a fascinating cultural dimension here. Research has shown that people who speak tonal languages like Mandarin, Cantonese, or Vietnamese are statistically more likely to develop perfect pitch. Actually, in a groundbreaking study from 2006, Psychologist Diana Deutsch and her team found that Mandarin-speaking music students were significantly more likely to have perfect pitch than English-speaking students, even when both groups had received similar amounts of musical training. It's thought that because tonal languages rely on pitch to distinguish word meanings, the brain develops a more refined pitch sensitivity from a super early age, sometimes even before the age of 4, which is believed to be the critical period for acquiring absolute pitch. Take Mandarin, for example. The word ma can mean mother, hemp, horse, or scold, depending entirely on the tone. And I'm not even going to remotely try to pronounce all 4 words here, but you get the point. So, from a very young age, children growing up in these linguistic environments have to pay close attention to pitch. Not for music, but for everyday communication. So, essentially, the same part of the brain that helps a child differentiate between different tones in Mandarin might just be laying the groundwork for perfect pitch later on. And that leads to a bigger question. Is perfect pitch something that you're born with, or is it something that you can train? Basically, is it nature or nurture? One of society's favourite debates. And honestly, this particular debate has been going on for years. And like most nature versus nurture arguments, the answer seems to be both. Kind of. So let's start with what we know from the science. So there's definitely a genetic component to perfect pitch. Twin studies have shown that if one identical twin has perfect pitch, the other is far more likely to have it too, compared to fraternal twins. And that suggests that there's some heritable element at play. But, and this is a big but, it's not just in the genes. Early training actually appears to be absolutely critical. Most people who develop perfect pitch start musical training before the age of 6. That early exposure seems to align with a critical window in brain development, when the auditory cortex is still superplastic and open to forming lifelong associations between sound and meaning. Think of it like learning a first language. If you're exposed early enough, your brain just sort of absorbs the rules. It becomes automatic. But if you start later in life, it's definitely possible, but it takes more work, and often it's never quite as fluent. In fact, researchers have explored this exact idea. One study in 2014 trained 24 children under the age of 6 using a method that involved naming notes and colours. After just a few months of consistent, almost game-like training, all of them developed pitch recognition skills that would qualify as perfect pitch. It's actually super wild. It strongly suggests that perfect pitch isn't just a fixed you have it or you don't trait. It's something that might be learnable, given the right conditions. And when we talk about these associations, it's not just abstract tones floating in space. We're talking about very specific frequencies. Take the note A, for example. Most musicians will tell you that it's 440 Hz. And that's not a coincidence. It's actually the internationally recognized tuning standard, officially defined by the International Organization for Standardization. Basically, in 1939, a group of scientists and musicians got together in London and agreed, let's call 440 cycles per second A above middle C. And a few decades later, in 1955, they formalized it, and since then it's been the global reference pitch for tuning. But what's wild is that this standard isn't some law of nature. It's a human decision. Before that agreement, orchestras and countries used wildly different tunings. For instance, Baroque music was often tuned to around 415 Hz, while some 19th century European orchestras crept as high as 452 Hz. So if you were born in Vienna in 1850, your idea of A might have been totally different from someone born in Tokyo today. So when someone with perfect pitch hears a note and says, that's an A, their brain isn't just pulling that knowledge out of air. They're matching it, consciously or unconsciously, to this culturally agreed upon framework. And in that way, perfect pitch isn't just an innate perceptual gift. It's also a learned cognitive mapping that relies on exposure to specific tuning systems. It's kind of like how we learn the names of colors. The spectrum is continuous, but we draw boundaries around certain shades and call them blue or green. And perfect pitch does something similar for sound. And I think that that's such an important reminder that even something as seemingly natural and mysterious as perfect pitch is shaped by culture, context, and collective decisions. We all hear sound, but what we do with that sound, how we label and understand it, is deeply influenced by the musical environment that we grew up in. But what about the rest of us? The adults or late starters? Is there still hope? Well, kind of. There's been a rise in perfect pitch training apps over the last few years. Things like Perfect Ear, Functional Ear Trainer, or Tone Gym. And these apps offer exercises where you repeatedly guess or match tones, sometimes with the help of mnemonics, memory games, or even color associations. Some people do report slight improvements, especially in terms of being able to recognize a few specific notes consistently. But the truth is, most adults don't develop true perfect pitch, at least not the automatic, effortless kind. Instead, what tends to happen is that they build this kind of hybrid skill, more like a supercharged form of what we spoke about earlier, this relative pitch, where they can use memory and associations to calculate notes pretty quickly. And honestly, that's not a bad thing at all. Because here's the thing, relative pitch, not perfect pitch, is actually what most musicians use on a day-to-day basis. It's the skill that helps you recognize how notes relate to each other, not just what they are in isolation. It's what allows you to harmonize with a melody, improvise a solo, transpose a song into a different key, and just understand the emotional shape of a chord progression. It's trainable, flexible, and incredibly powerful. In fact, many of the greatest musicians in the world rely on relative pitch, not perfect pitch. Think about jazz improvisers, vocalists, producers. They're not naming notes in real time. They're responding to context, to feeling, to intervals. So while perfect pitch can kind of seem like a superpower, relative pitch might be the real superpower that most musicians actually need. This has sparked a really interesting philosophical debate in music education. On one hand, some educators worry that we become a bit too obsessed with perfect pitch, treating it like a kind of musical IQ badge or the Mensa membership of the music world. It can create this false hierarchy and almost elitism, where kids or older musicians who don't have it feel somehow less musical, even though their skills might be more practical, intuitive, and even more adaptable. On the other hand, there are those who argue if the research shows that perfect pitch can be taught, especially if exposure happens early enough, then why not try? Especially since it seems to be linked to language development, auditory memory, and even emotional nuance. Maybe it's not about labeling pitches, but training the brain to be more in tune, more deeply to sound. It also opens up interesting questions about what we value in music education. Are we only trying to create technically skilled musicians? Or are we nurturing more attentive listeners and more emotionally attuned individuals? If cultivating pitch sensitivity can enrich not only musical abilities, but also listening skills, memory, and emotional expression, then maybe there's more to gain than we realize. It becomes less about chasing perfection and more about broadening our perceptual world through sound. Others worry that if we overemphasize pitch naming, we risk turning music into a cold, technical exercise, which becomes less about emotion and creativity and more about getting the right answer. After all, some of the most soul-stirring, innovative, and genre-defining musicians couldn't name every note by ear, but they have impeccable timing, expressive phrasing, rich intuition, and deep musical feel. And that's the bigger picture here. Pitch perception lives on a spectrum. It's not about being good or bad at music. Whether you can name every note you hear, or whether you're just beginning to train your ear to recognize patterns and intervals, both ways of relating to sound are valid, beautiful, and deeply musical. In the end, what matters most isn't whether you have perfect pitch, it's whether you're present with the music, whether you listen, feel, whether you connect with it. So, we've talked about what perfect pitch is and where it might come from, but let's zoom in on something a little juicier. What is it actually like to live with perfect pitch? Is it a musical superpower that gives you a leg up in every setting? Or are there hidden downsides that we don't talk about enough? First, let's start with the positives. Yes, perfect pitch can be incredibly helpful, especially in specific musical contexts. If you're a classical musician, having perfect pitch can mean that you never need a reference note to start singing or playing in key. You're less likely to go sharp or flat because your internal compass is always on. Some musicians say that it's like having a tuning fork embedded in your brain. And for composers and songwriters, it can speed up the creative process. You hear something in your head and you already know what key it's in. You're not fumbling around the keyboard trying to figure out what chord you just imagined. You just know. As a singer-songwriter, I always dreamt about having that skill, coming up with a song in your mind. There's nothing more frustrating about not being able to execute it by yourself. And there's also studies that suggest that people with perfect pitch often have superior memory for musical details. They might not just remember a melody, but exactly what key it was in, and so on. It's almost like a snapshot of the sound. Whether you're tuning strings, matching harmonies, or correcting a group's pitch on the fly, you're the go-to person. If you're jamming with a band and someone throws out a line in an unfamiliar key, you can land on the right notes instinctively. You're not counting intervals, you're responding in real time. Sounds like a dream, right? But, and there's always a but, perfect pitch can also be a bit of a curse. Some people with perfect pitch describe feeling sensory overload in certain situations. Imagine sitting in an ensemble where someone's just slightly out of tune, but your brain hears it like nails on a chalkboard. You can't ignore it. That rigidity, the very thing that gives perfect pitch its power, can also make musical flexibility way harder. Transposing music, for example, moving a piece from one key to another, it comes naturally to many musicians with relative pitch. But for those with perfect pitch, the shift can feel disorienting. Their brain is so strongly wired to match a sound with a specific pitch label that changing it even slightly can make a song feel completely, quote-unquote, wrong. There are stories of professional musicians struggling in rehearsals when a singer wants to lower a piece by a semitone, for example, or becoming visibly uncomfortable when an orchestra uses more historical tunings, or plays slightly off the modern 440 Hz standard. In everyday life, it can be even more frustrating. Picture this, you're at your child's school concert, you're wanting to beam with pride, but instead you're stuck there literally gritting your teeth because every note is a tiny bit sharp. Or you're at a karaoke night with friends and the machine is calibrated maybe a semitone too low. Everyone else is singing their hearts out and all you can hear is how wrong everything sounds. What should be a joyful, communal, messy musical moment turns into a mental obstacle course. There's also emerging research suggesting that people with absolute pitch may be more susceptible to certain forms of psychological stress. A 2015 study found that musicians with absolute pitch scored higher on measures of auditory hypersensitivity and even showed elevated traits associated with autism spectrum conditions, like a heightened need for structure and predictability. This doesn't mean that perfect pitch causes distress or, in fact, means that you're autistic, but it does hint at a correlation between pitch sensitivity and increased sensitivity in general, emotionally and sensorially. And that can spill into mental health. Constantly noticing tiny imperfections in pitch or feeling unable to enjoy music unless it meets a very narrow standard can lead to frustration, performance anxiety, or even avoidance in some cases. What was once a joyful connection to music becomes a double-edged sword, a gift that almost isolates. So yeah, perfect pitch can be powerful. It can make you faster, sharper, more precise. But it can also make you more rigid, more overwhelmed, and in some situations, less able to let go and just enjoy the music. And that's the paradox. Honestly, I think that tension, the tug of war between control, perfection, and play, is just kind of what music's all about. Because music isn't meant to be perfect. It's meant to move us. And whether you hear a slightly flat note or not, the emotion underneath is really what sticks with you. Now, I asked you all over on Threads to talk to me a little bit about your own experiences with perfect pitch so that I could discuss some of your stories in today's episode. So I want to unpack some of your own experiences and kind of read out some of those responses and discuss them a little bit. So the first response I've got here says, I found out in middle school when they tested us for a new band program they were starting and wanted to ensure success by including only musically gifted students, or what they thought that meant. Now this is really interesting. We're starting off on a really intriguing note here, getting into that kind of music education segment that I spoke about just now. It really highlights how schools and music programs often define musical talent in quite narrow terms, like perfect pitch being treated as a benchmark for musical giftedness. And I can't imagine the pressure that put not only on you, but also the kids that maybe weren't selected for that band program. It's quite crazy. But I think it also raises an important question, like, what does musically gifted even mean? Because yes, of course, perfect pitch is super impressive, but like we spoke about, musicality is so much more than that. And I wonder how many students without perfect pitch were overlooked, even though they might have had incredible potential in other areas. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think it really opens up this bigger conversation about how we assess talent, especially in educational settings, and what we might be unintentionally missing when we chase precision over possibility. Someone else said, I found out in high school. My director put me on one side of the piano and started playing random single notes and asking me to tell him what note they were, and I named every single one without really thinking about it. He then asked me to sing certain notes and I hit every one, once again without having to really think about it. Hearing something or someone that is flat or sharp is excruciating to me. I could never be an elementary or junior high school band or orchestra teacher. That's really funny. It does relate to the kind of curse side of perfect pitch that I was speaking about. And once again, it happened in school with a musical director. Another one says, I found out in a middle school choir when the director had the audacity to transpose the song down a pitch, thus making it near impossible for me to read the music because the notes kept coming out of the piano and they weren't matching up with what was on the page. I raised my hand and asked why he would do that, and he asked if I had perfect pitch. I had no idea what he was talking about, so he tested me, and sure enough, I had perfect pitch. I honestly thought everyone could do that. Again, super funny, just kind of realizing it in that real life setting of being uncomfortable and realizing, why is no one else feeling the same way that I do? I bet your choir mates were super confused. Someone else speaks about their younger experience, that when I was 6 years old taking piano lessons, I could never read music, but I learned the songs fast. One day, my piano teacher told me to spin around on the bench so my back was towards the keys, and she would play notes and I'd tell her what they were. I was always good at assignments in music class throughout school, but other than that, I haven't really used the skill. I'm 49 now and regret quitting piano. Wow, I really hear the bittersweetness in what you said. That regret about quitting piano, you're definitely not alone. I feel like so many people with musical potential feel that tug later in life, wondering what would have happened if they just kept going. But just remember that your skill is still there. It might be a little bit dusty, but it's still real. And just because you haven't used it professionally or in a performance, it doesn't make it any less valuable. The brain's musical wiring is so resilient, so if you ever did want to revisit it even casually, it might surprise you how quickly things come back. And that also reminds me that perfect pitch doesn't always lead to a music career, and that's okay. Sometimes it might just become a quiet companion in the background of your life, which shapes how you listen to music, notice other details, or even just connect emotionally to sound in a unique way. So thank you so much for sharing that. On the other side of that experience, someone else said that they found out pretty early. I was around 8 or 9. Back then, I explained it to myself by saying, well, I sang a lot in choir, maybe that's how I memorized the notes. Perfect pitch is probably one of the reasons I've spent over 30 years living with music every single day. Now I work as an ear training and music theory teacher, and I know that perfect pitch is not a requirement for being a great musician, but I won't lie, having it is very convenient. I love this, and honestly, singing in choir probably did help reinforce your pitch memory, so I think child you wasn't entirely wrong. But this really highlights that perfect pitch isn't just a party trick, it's really become a kind of companion over a lifetime, and I love the fact that you've turned it into an ability to help others learn. That's just amazing. And just to wrap up this section, I want to highlight a couple of examples that focus more on the difficulties that they face. Someone said that mine seemed to come on gradually as an adult. As far as impacting my life, it's mostly negatives. Sure, I can impress people with my ability to pull a note out of thin air, but I get confused when people want to transpose the key from what is written. My ears keep telling me I'm on the wrong note, so I adjust and then I really am on the wrong note. I can usually compensate for that, but it's an extra level of concentration. Someone else said that perfect pitch can be active or passive. You might only name notes when you hear them, or you are able to sing a specific note out of nowhere with no reference, and it's not 100% reliable. For example, I don't hear electric guitar well. The sound is harder to place. And when I'm tired or have a headache, my pitch sense gets blurry. And honestly, without solid theory knowledge and ear training, perfect pitch alone won't take you very far. I think that these two responses offer such a rich and nuanced view of what it actually feels like to live with perfect pitch beyond the textbook definitions that I could explain. It's not a flawless superhuman ability. It's context dependent, it's variable, and sometimes it's inconvenient. And also just highlighting the way that fatigue and headaches can blur pitch perception as well. It really highlights that the skill isn't static. It fluctuates just like any other human sense. Thank you all so much for sharing such honest and layered reflections. I'm always in awe of the way that you're able to put things into words and share them with me. So thank you so much. And if you're not already part of our community on Threads, do join us over there at the Sound Mind Talks. I've got over 12,000 of you as part of our community now. It's amazing to have these in-depth discussions with you. So yeah, come and join us. So we've just heard some really fascinating stories from you all about living with perfect pitch, the benefits, the burdens, and everything in between. But now I want to take us to the opposite end of the pitch perception spectrum, because while some people are born with a heightened sensitivity to pitch, others are born almost completely without it. And this is where we get into something called amusia. And this is sometimes casually called tone deafness, but it's a real neurological condition that affects how the brain processes music. And to be clear, it's not just someone who's bad at singing or says that they don't have any rhythm. It's so much deeper than that. So there are two main types. You've got congenital amusia, which you're born with, and then you have acquired amusia, which can occur later in life, often due to brain injury, like after a stroke or trauma. People with congenital amusia typically struggle with really basic elements of music, like recognizing familiar tunes, distinguishing between notes that go up or down, matching pitch when they try to sing, or even perceiving music as music. Instead, it might just sound like a confusing jumble of noise. And it's estimated that around 4% of the population has some form of amusia. And that's not a tiny number. Think about it. 1 in 25 people might have real trouble connecting to music in the way that most of us take for granted. Now, I want to insert a clip here from Oliver Sacks, the late neurologist and author of probably my favorite book of all time, Musicophilia, which includes a whole chapter on amusia. I think there's no better way that I can put it into words, so I'm going to let him explain.
A number of people have a tin ear, or they're a bit tone deaf, or they have difficulty singing in tune, but they can still enjoy music. But there's something which is very rare, where there is a total inability to perceive music as music. People speak here of amusia, of congenital amusia. Sometimes amusia can occur from a brain injury or a tumor. Sometimes one may be born with it. People like this really can't tell one tune from another. I first encountered this in a colleague, a French neurologist called L'Hermite. And L'Hermite told me that if music was played, he could either say this was the Marseillaise or it wasn't. More than that he couldn't say. Now, I'm afraid I didn't ask him what the Marseillaise was like and how he knew it was the Marseillaise. Would people sort of salute or stand to attention? Did they have a special look? Or was it the rhythm? Or how did he know, and what did it sound like? But anyhow, some years later, in fact, fairly recently, I've had a chance to talk to a delightful, intelligent woman who has this condition. She describes how, as a child, she came from a rather musical family. She couldn't recognize any tune. She couldn't distinguish tunes. And her mother would get furious and say, "What have you got against music?" And her father tried to train her with records. It was useless. As a young woman, her boyfriends would like to take her to concerts, and she would say yes. But she was partly bored and partly excruciated. I said, "Why excruciated? What did it sound like to you?" And she said, "You want to know what it sounds like?" She says, "When you play what you call music," she says, "because to me it sounds like a rattling of pots and pans. If you went into the kitchen and you threw all the pots and pans on the floor, it's noise." And I was sort of really rather appalled by this, and I felt very sympathetic to her. She, in fact, then described how in '98 she'd seen an article in a newspaper describing how some researchers in Montreal were working on congenital amusia, and she contacted them and met them, and they investigated her, and they very much reassured her in a way. They said, first, yes, This was she wasn't the only person in the world. It was a recognizable condition, and there were a few other people whom they'd be happy to introduce her to who also had congenital amusia. They said it wasn't anything emotional. It wasn't because she hated the music or hated her mother. It was a neurological condition, and there were definite changes in the brain which went with this. And they also told her, which was very important, they said, if your husband asks you to go to a concert, say, you go. You go, I'm amusic. And she said, I only wish they had told me this when I was 7 and not when I was 70, so I didn't have a lifetime of having to bear music, so-called, which for me, is like pots and pans.
Isn't it fascinating? Because here's the thing. In most cultures, music isn't just entertainment, right? It's a shared language. It's weddings and birthdays, funerals, Friday night hangouts, lullabies, and national anthems. So if your brain can't decode music, that can make you feel left out in really profound ways. And just like Sachs describes, it's unbearable having to live just listening to what sounds like pots and pans. Some people with amusia even describe avoiding music altogether because it makes them feel awkward or alienated. Others say that they still enjoy music, just in their own way, focusing on rhythm or lyrics instead of melody. And again, this highlights something really important. Music isn't just a one-size-fits-all. It's how we experience it, whether with heightened sensitivity or almost none. That's incredibly individual and often invisible from the outside. So, whether you're someone who can name every note in a chord or someone who's never really understood why people cry at Coldplay, your experience is valid. And exploring both ends of this musical spectrum helps us understand just how rich, diverse, and mysterious our relationship with sound really is. Okay, so we've heard how perfect pitch can make someone hyper-aware of the musical world around them, and how amusia can make that same world feel like noise. But what's actually happening under the hood, neurologically speaking? What's going on in the brain when we process pitch? Well, thanks to advances in brain imaging like fMRI and PET scans, we can now quite literally watch the brain light up in real time as someone listens to music. And as it turns out, pitch perception isn't just a simple one-stop auditory process. It's an orchestrated neural dance involving multiple areas across both hemispheres of the brain. When we hear a musical note, the first major stop is the primary auditory cortex, which is located in a region just above your ear. It's basically the brain's sound processing HQ. But when it comes to pitch, things get even more interesting. Research shows that pitch discrimination, especially fine pitch detail, leans heavily on the right hemisphere, particularly the right auditory cortex. One study found that this region becomes especially active when people try to identify, compare, or remember pitches. So when you're recognizing a note, matching it to another, or just mentally holding on to it, it's this area that's doing most of the heavy lifting. But what's really fascinating is how individual differences shape the way that this region works. In people with perfect pitch, the brain doesn't just respond differently, it actually looks different. Some studies have shown more focused activation, greater grey matter density, and even stronger connectivity between the auditory cortex and memory-related areas. In other words, it's not just that they hear sound, it's that their brain has built shortcut highways between pitch and memory, almost like recognizing a familiar face. They don't calculate the note, they just know it. But on the flip side, individuals with amusia show something else entirely. Their brains often exhibit reduced connectivity or atypical activation in the same regions. One theory is that amusia involves a disruption in the pathway that links pitch perception with conscious awareness. So the brain hears the sound, but it doesn't fully make sense of it. It's a bit like seeing letters but not being able to read. The input is there, but the integration is off. And it's kind of wild when you think about that. It's the same auditory cortex, the same sound waves hitting your ears, but depending on how your brain is wired through genetics, development, training, or even injury, you might experience the musical world in radically different ways. For one person, a single note sparks instant recognition, but for another, it's an indistinct blur. And for most of us, we're somewhere in the middle, using relative pitch, memory, emotion, and context to piece things together. It's a powerful reminder that music isn't just about sound, it's all about perception, how the brain transforms vibration and airwaves into meaning, movement, and emotion. And that's what makes music such a rich playground for psychologists, neuroscientists, and educators. The more we understand how the brain engages with music, the better we can teach it, appreciate it, and use it as a tool for connection. And that's exactly why this spectrum matters. Not everyone processes music the same way. But the truth is, you don't need perfect pitch to make music, or to love it, or be changed by it. Perfect pitch might be rare, but musicality is everywhere. It shows up in the way that someone taps a beat on the steering wheel, hums along to a favorite show tune, or tears up during a film score. It's in the way that a rhythm makes your body move before your brain even catches up. It's in lyrics that say what you couldn't say, and the chords that hit you right in the gut. It's not just about pitch, it's about emotion, memory, rhythm, movement, and identity. Even for those with amusia, who process pitch differently or not at all, music can still offer joy, connection, and meaning. Maybe it's through the beat. Maybe it's through the energy of a crowd. Or maybe it's just a feeling of belonging when everyone is singing, even if it's off-key. We all engage with music in our own way, and that's worth celebrating. And when we stop treating one end of that spectrum as the right way, we make room for empathy, for understanding how others hear, feel, and connect. Because at the end of the day, music isn't just about technical skill. It's about feeling, it's about connection, and about how sound becomes something more for all of us, something human. I've really enjoyed today's episode, and I really hope you have too. Thank you so much for joining me today on The Sound Mind. If you have enjoyed the episode, please rate or review on wherever you're listening and share it with someone who loves music just as much as you do. Or maybe you know someone with perfect pitch that might just find it interesting. Don't forget to follow us and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And also don't forget to come and say hi on Instagram and on Threads at The Sound Mind Talks. But until next time, keep listening, keep reflecting, and I'll see you on The Sound Mind.